So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about fertility. And we saw in the previous class some concepts and also some rates of like how to estimate crude birth rate and also the general fertility rate. And here I corrected or I added information that this graph is about live births and the general fertility rate for the US. So I added and updated to the slides in the course website as well. And we talk about the age-specific fertility rate. Sorry. We stopped on the general sorry. Yeah, we talk about the age-specific fertility rate, the total fertility rate, and then I showed how the total fertility rate is really associated with economic changes. In the case of the US, that's really clear how the economy really is associated and drives the levels of fertility. Talked about the uteri, the natural fertility, and then we stopped here on the gross reproduction rate. And the gross reproduction rate, so it adds this new concept of reproduction with the idea now that we are counting not the overall number of children that women are having, but the number of daughters that they are having. And the idea is that here we want to know if women on average are having one daughter throughout their reproductive lives, so these daughters can replace their mothers and in order to have babies in future generations. And so we need really specific data. So we need female births per age group of women, and age group of women going from X to X plus N in each one of these groups, as we have seen before. But now these rates here only take into account numerator, the number of female births. And we multiply by 5, which is the width of the interval, which is usually the width that we're using for the interval. If we don't have information about female births by age group of mothers, one way that you can approximate the estimation of the gross reproduction rate is to get the total fertility rate, which uses the age-specific fertility rates in the numerator, both boys and girls, and then you multiply by the overall proportion of girls of female births in that specific country in that specific year. And this constant here, 0.488, is based on the sex ratio at birth in most countries. Usually, most countries have the sex ratio at birth equals to 105. We already discussed this in the course, saying that this is usually the biological normal, in which you have 105 boys being born in a specific year in a specific country for every 100 girls. So based on this information, how do you get into this 0.488, which is the proportion of female births in a specific country in a specific year? So the proportion of female births is pretty much 1 minus the proportion of male births. What's the proportion of male births when we have a sex ratio at birth equals to 105? So you have 105 births of boys for every 100 births of women, of baby girls. So the overall number of births in that specific case would be 105 boys plus 100 girls. 105 divided by 205 is exactly the proportion of male births in that specific society that has a sex ratio at birth equals 105, which is the biological normal of sex ratio at birth. So if you have 51% of male births, 1 minus 0.51, you have a proportion of female births equal to 0.488, in other words, 48.8%. If some countries have sex ratio at birth much higher than 105, then you should implement the same formula. Instead of having here 105, let's say that China had like 120 in specific years. So you put 120 here and here to calculate the proportion of female births. And, but this is only if you are trying to estimate the gross reproduction rate and you don't have the number of female births by age of mothers. You just have the overall proportion of female births, okay? The next rate, the net reproduction rate, it takes again into account the same thing that we saw before for the gross reproduction rate. So we have here the age-specific fertility rates for all the specific age groups of women, taking into account only female births. But it considers now a new factor, the factor of mortality among mothers from the time of birth of their daughters. So the idea is that these mothers that will have the chance of having these daughters here, some of them might not survive until the age of 49. Some of these mothers will die before reaching 49 years of age. So you have to consider that factor of mortality in order to say, okay, they might not reach the age of 45, which is the last age in the reproduction age. And we kind of like have to discount. Some mothers will die before that. So the other mothers that survive up to 49, you have to have a little more births of daughters for the daughters to replace the mothers, to have on average 1 daughter per mother. And these measures here, they will be easier for you to understand when we go into the chapter about mortality. So let's go here. This big LXN is the total number of person years lived in a specific age group that goes from X to X plus N. So this is pretty much the total number of years that women in a specific age group will live in that specific age group. And this is the total number of women that were born from that specific cohort. This L0 is the number of people at age 0. And then you just multiply by 5 because that gives you the number of women who would be alive at the beginning of the interval or the beginning when they were born. Multiply by 5 because you have the width of the age group equals to N equals to 5. This, again, this ratio here is going to be a little difficult to understand now, but this is pretty much a factor of mortality that we are including in this rate. And we're going to better understand it when we talk about life tables in the chapter about mortality. And this is pretty much saying some women will die before they reach the end of each one of these age groups between 15 and 49 years of age. Some women will die at age 19, some at 24, some at 32, and so on. So you have to discount the fact that some of these women will die, and then this will decrease the number of daughters that they will have. So this proportion here is the proportion of people who survive from age 0 to the midpoint of each one of the 7 age intervals. Which 7 age intervals? 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, until 45 to 49. And the width of the interval is the same as before, I. So if you compare the net reproduction rate formula with the gross reproduction rate, the original one, the difference is that now we have this new factor of mortality. Everything else is similar. Let's say that you don't know the number of daughters for each one of the age group of mothers. So you just get the original age-specific fertility rates and multiply by 0.488, which is the same thing as the previous slide, which is this one here, right? But what's important to understand from the net reproduction rate is that here we are saying, okay, women will have this chance here of having daughters throughout their reproductive lives, but some of these women will die throughout these reproductive ages between 15 and 49. So they will not be exposed to all these rates. And then we deduct this mortality factor, and the net reproduction rate will be, of course, smaller than the gross reproduction rate, because the net reproduction rate is discounting the chances of people dying. And the final measure here on this portion of the lecture is the mean length of a generation. The mean length of a generation is the mean age of mothers giving birth to live daughters with the current age-specific fertility and mortality rates. How do you calculate the mean length of a generation? You use the same information as we used before for the net reproduction rate in the numerator here. So this portion here, so the average production of daughters per woman, considering the mortality of women. And then you multiply by the midpoint on the age group, and you divide exactly by the net reproduction rate. Right? So here we have the female births per woman in age group, the proportion of people who survive from age 0 until the midpoint of that specific age group, and the width of the interval. So as I mentioned in the previous class, in our course website, we have, I have some files there that are zipped Excel files. If you go into the lecture about fertility, example of fertility rates in Excel. So what's the question, Patrick? I don't understand the question. So it's a more limiting form of NRR? Can you just unmute yourself and ask? The mean age is just to know what's the age, the average age that women are usually having their daughters throughout their reproductive ages. The NRR gives us the average number of daughters that women are having, considering the mortality of women. The mean length of a generation is not the number of daughters, it's the average age in which women are having these daughters, taking into account the mortality of women. So there's two different things. And it's going to be clear more like in the Excel tables. So in the Excel tables, if you just download this file, this Excel fertility.zip, we're going to have two files here, fertility rates in Brazil and fertility rates in the US. And the one in Brazil is really simple. You're just getting I just went into a Brazilian website and I got information about like the number of women in each one of these years for each one of the 7 5-year age groups. All right, so we have each one of those. And I also got information about how many children women in this age group had back in 1994, 1995, until 2005. If I divide just this number here by this number here, I have the age-specific fertility rate. So the age-specific fertility rate, I just divide the cell from the births spreadsheet by the cell in the female population spreadsheet. And just see. Yeah. So this is pretty much the age-specific fertility rate. And see that I did not multiply it by 1,000. Because remember, from our formula here, this formula here for the age-specific fertility rate. This is the formula for the age-specific fertility rate. Number of births for women in specific age group. These are the age groups divided by the number of women in those age groups. We can multiply by 1,000 just because these numbers can get really small, so we can get this information per 1,000. But my final objective is to estimate the total fertility rate. So I will not multiply by 1,000, and then if I just pretty much just add all these age-specific fertility rates, I have the total fertility rate. It's really simple. And I sum this all and multiply by 5. And remember, the total fertility rate, it's exactly that. We are summing all the age-specific fertility rates and multiply by the width of the interval. I don't need to divide by 1,000 because I did not multiply the age-specific fertility rates by 1,000 before. And here I'm saying that if a group of women are exposed to these age-specific fertility rates throughout their reproductive lives between 15 and 49 years of age, they will have on average 1.82, right? And then here in Brazil specific, it can increase up to 219 and then start to decrease again in more recent years. This is an overall average, one single measure that combine all the age-specific fertility rates the same way as we saw here. But we can also plot these age-specific fertility rates in the same way as we did in these graphs. And this is the graph that's pretty much plotting all these years of data. It gets a little confusing, but it's just to show you that Brazil has that same pattern of age-specific fertility rates, lower for younger ages, go up on the age group of 2024, and then start to decline again. Cool? The file about fertility rates in the US, it's we estimate more of those rates that I introduced to you here before. But we're going to do it just for 1 year. For Brazil, we pretty much do the age-specific fertility rate, the total fertility rate for several years. In that case of the US, we're going to do only for 1 year, only data from 2012, and I will explain to you how to estimate all those rates that we just saw in these slides. So in this case here, just in case we have the information about like births for women between 10 to 14 years of age, that's usually not used on the analysis of total fertility rate and gross reproduction rate, but we can add them as well. In this specific example, I'm adding the 10 to 14 age group, but I usually go from 15 to 49. And I just followed the example that it was in this textbook here. So in this specific age group, the first thing that we can do is to get the midpoint of the age group. This information here, we're going to use just towards the end. What's the midpoint of the age group, which will be used for the mean length of a generation, which is this variable here. We need this midpoint of age group. What exactly is that? It's pretty much just getting what's the midpoint here. I just get 14 minus 10 divided by 2. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's oh yeah, it's 14 minus, because it's like 4 years in between. It's 14 plus 10 divided by 2. Cool. So that's for 12, and then you add 0.5 because to try to reach exactly the midpoint of that age group. So that's how this midpoint of the age group is calculated. And the same thing for this ones here. You just get 15 plus 19 times 2 divided by 2, and then you get the 17 and you add 0.5 to reach the midpoint of the age group. All the cells here highlighted in yellow are raw data that we calculated, that we got from other sources. So this is the same thing that we did for Brazil, in the example for the Excel spreadsheet from Brazil. So we just get here the number of women in a specific age group. For each one of these age groups, number of women between 10 to 14 years of age, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, and so on. And then we have 83 million women in between 10 and 49 years of age. And here is the number of births to women in that specific age group. So here's the number of children that women in this specific age group are having. Of course, women between 10 to 14, the numbers are really small, and then it starts to go up. And here's both male and female births. How do you do the age-specific fertility rate? Just remember from the slides, the age-specific fertility rate, you divide the number of births of women in a specific age group by the overall population of women in that specific age group. So you just divide this one by this one, and you do it for everybody. And then afterwards, what you do, you just add them up and multiply by the width of the interval to get the total fertility rate. So you add them up here, get this result, and then you multiply 0.37 by 5, you get a total fertility rate equals to 1.88. Right? So that's what we did for the age-specific fertility rate and for the total fertility rate. The general fertility rate, if you remember, it's a simpler measure. It's pretty much the number of births by the female population between 15 and 49 years of age, multiplied by 1,000. So how this is done, you just get the overall number of births here of women between 15 and 44, sum everybody here in the numerator, and then you divide by the sum of all women in between those ages. So you get the sum of births for women between 15 and 44 divided by the sum of women in those same ages and multiplied by 1,000. It's a simpler estimation because we're just getting the overall number of births of those women and divided by the overall number of women. The age-specific fertility rate does that division for each one of the age groups, right? So the 62.8 here, we pretty much just implemented this formula, and then we did the age-specific fertility rate, and then we did the total fertility rate. The next one is we're going to estimate the reproduction rates, both the gross reproduction rate and the net reproduction rate. And for that, we need an additional information that we did not have for the case of Brazil. And the additional information is the number of female births to women in each one of these age groups. We have 3,672 female and male births in total. Out of those, we have 1,794 daughters being born to women between 10 and 14 years of age. So these are the number of daughters being born for women in each one of these age groups. So what we are trying to do now is to estimate the gross reproduction rate. The age-specific fertility rate is the number of female births per woman in a specific age group. So we first have to estimate the ASFRF, that considers only female births. We get this number here, female births, and divided by the number of women. And we do that for all the other intervals. This one divided by this. We sum them all, and we multiply by 5, which is the width of these intervals. So we just implemented this formula here. We added them all and multiply by 5. So this is the gross reproduction rate. So what is the general fertility rate? we are saying that overall, for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 44, we had 62.8 births in the US in 2012, including births of men, boys, and girls. What is this total fertility rate telling us? If women are exposed to these specific fertility rates, for these age-specific fertility rates throughout their reproductive lives, they will have, on average, 1.88 children between the ages of 10 and 49, because this is information of all births. The gross reproduction rate is saying if women are exposed to these age-specific fertility rates that consider only female births, they will have, on average, 0.918 daughters throughout their reproductive ages, and in this case, considering from ages 10 to 49. Okay? So if we expose a group of women to these age-specific fertility rates throughout between the ages of 10 and 49, they will have on average 1.88 children. If we expose to those rates here, they will have on average 0.918 daughters. And this woman between 10 and 49. Now, the next information that we need from other sources, will measure the factor of mortality. Let's just go now into this slide about the net reproduction rate. We need this total number of person years lived in each one of the age groups. So if we have, let's say, 100,000 women were born in a specific year in a specific country, 100,000. And all of them survive from age 0 until the end of age 4. So they reach the next age group of 5 to 9. So it means that this 100,000 women, nobody died. Each one of them lived 5 years. The year in which they were 0 years old, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So each woman lived a total of 5 person years, because nobody died in this example. Altogether, these 100,000 women lived altogether between the ages of 0 until the end of age 4, 500,000 years. These are the person years. Let's say that women don't die. All women, they reach the age they go until the end of age 49. They reach age 50. Let's say that all women reach age 50. So nobody dies. If these 100,000 women that were born in a specific year, in a specific country, nobody died throughout all these years, these 100,000 women would have lived between the ages of 10 and 14, 500,000 years, person years. Each woman would have lived 5 years herself, 100,000 women, 500,000 in total. So these are the person years, how many years they all together lived in between this interval. But the fact is that some of these women die. Some of them, they start on, they reach age 10, but they don't reach age 15. So the ones that, the number of person years that this woman here, from the specific data that we got from the US in 2012, is that between 10 and 14, 496,173 person years were calculated for a woman in this age group. What does it mean? That some of these women died before reaching 10 years of age, and some of them died within this interval. So we didn't count 500,000 person years. Again, This is going to be a little bit simpler and easier to understand when we talk about life tables in the mortality chapter. What it's important to understand here is that these women keep dying. Some that were alive here do not survive until when they reach age 15. They will die before. So the number of person years between ages 15 and 19 is smaller than before, and they keep dying. So the number of person years between 20 and 24 is smaller than before. So these are all the overall number of years that these women live together within that age group, which is called person years. And then based on this information, what's the proportion of women surviving to the midpoint of that specific age interval? So we get this number here, divide by 5 times this number here, because in my example, I'm using this cohort of women that 100,000 of them were alive. And that's what I do. I get this, the big LXN, the number of person years of women who live between 10 and 14, divide by how many women were alive, and multiply by 5, because we have 5-year age groups. And this big LXN, all this information here is calculated based on mortality rates of this woman in these specific age groups, in this specific year, in this specific country. So what is important to say is that this information here is based on information from mortality rates. And here we have the proportion of women surviving to the midpoint of that specific age interval. So 99.23% of women, they reached the age of 12.5 years. 99.12 reached the age of 17.5. Some of them died. And then only 98.93 reached the age of 22.5. Until the last one, 96% of women reached the age of 47.5, right? So this is the proportion of women surviving to the midpoint of the age interval, which is this portion here of the formula. So now we have the age-specific fertility rates only considering female births, which is here. There's this column. We have this proportion of women living up to the midpoint of that specific age interval, which is here. And then you multiply one by the other. So what's the idea here? The gross reproduction rate, what did the gross reproduction rate do? Just added up all these rates, added here, and multiply by 5. The net reproduction rate is kind of giving a discount because some of these women will die. So instead of being a rate of 0.0002, it's going to be a number a little bit below that, because some of these women did not survive until the mid of this age interval. Only 99.23% of them did. And then this number here is going to get a little smaller. If we get more decimal cases, you're going to see that this number more. So this number gets a little smaller because some women died before they reach age 12.5. The same thing here. So this one multiplied by this, we get this number here. We might say like, okay, they would have this, this is the rate of having daughters, but because only 99.12 of them reach the age of 17.5, this rate is going to go lower. And all these rates here are going to be a little lower than this one. The 003 is the same thing. If you just put more decimal cases, you're going to see the differences. And then when you sum them all, the sum is going to be lower than this one, and you multiply by 5, which is the width of the age group, you get the net reproduction rate. So here There's just a correction here. This is just the label, but that's the correct way to say it. That's the same way that we had for the gross reproduction rate. We had the net reproduction rate, which you add everything and then you multiply by 5. So what is the difference between this one and this one? This one is, if women were exposed to these age-specific fertility rates related to female births, they would have on average 0.918 daughters throughout their reproductive ages, between 10 and 49. But we are not considering mortality of mothers. If we do take into consideration mortality of mothers, we're going to say if women are exposed to these age-specific fertility rates, considering only female births, and also considering that some of these women will not reach some of these age groups, they will have on average 0.905 daughters. So this one here is also considering only daughters, this one as well, but this one does not take into account mortality of women, and this one takes into account mortality of women, so considers only surviving women. Only is 99.2, 99.1, 99.9 surviving women into each one of these age groups. Right? So I'm just applying the same formulas as we saw here. And then finally, the mean length of a generation, you pretty much, you just get the information from the net reproduction rate and multiply by the midpoint of the age group. So you just get this information here that you calculated in order to get the net reproduction rate. But instead of summing them all, you first multiply it by the midpoint of the age group and you multiply by 5. So you get that information, multiply by 5, and multiply by the midpoint of the age group, which is exactly this. You get the proportion of daughters, so this is the age-specific fertility rates of females, and then the mortality factor, which is 1, 2. And then this one here now takes into account 1, 2, and 3, which is here 1, 2, and 3. And also the width of the interval, which is I, which is 5. And then you do that for all these age groups. You sum everything, and you get this number here. You have to still do one thing. Get this number here after you add everything, and you divide by the net reproduction rate. So what does this number mean? Women who are exposed to these age-specific fertility rates related to female births and taking into account these mortality factors will have daughters on average around the age of 28.6 years, right? So if women are exposed to these age-specific fertility rates and we do consider the mortality factor, they will have on average 0.905 daughters. And they will be having those daughters around the age of 28.6. Cool? And this is just to verify what we did before. It's just doing another calculation, another way to get the same result as we have here, right? But we, here on column 11, we finish and we pretty much implemented all these formulas. And just remember that this numerator here is considering this rate, which is the age-specific fertility rates of female births times the mortality factor, which is this portion, and then you multiply that by midpoint in the age group times 5, add everything, and then you get this number here, and you divide by the net reproduction rate, you get the mean length of a generation. So this number divided by this number, you get the mean reproduction rate. Right? And what's important for us to know, the calculation, if you have this spreadsheet, pretty much can just enter the numbers in these yellow cells, and the spreadsheet will calculate everything automatic for you. What's important for us is to interpret these results. Out of 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 44, they are having on average 62.8 births or children. If women were exposed to these specific fertility rates between the ages of 10 and 49, they would have on average 1.88 children. If women were exposed to these age-specific fertility rates that consider only female births, they would have on average 0.918 daughters. If women were exposed to these age-specific fertility rates that consider only female births, and if we deducted the fact that some of these women will die throughout their reproductive ages, this woman would have on average 0.905 daughters. And these daughters would be born when women would be on average 28.6 years, right? And this graph here is pretty much just getting the age-specific fertility rate just to show that we can also do the same exercise. And the highest rates here is verified for the age group 25 to 29. Cool? Questions? Cool. So now we calculated all these different fertility indicators. And it's good for us now to try to understand why some countries have higher fertility than others. Why some countries, women tend to have children at older ages than others. And now we are trying to understand, we are trying to not only estimate these fertility indicators, but we also want to understand what are the factors influencing these fertility levels. In the previous slides, we were pretty much estimating a series of different fertility indicators. And now we are trying to understand what is driving these fertility indicators to have those levels. So this framework here, and John Bongartz is a major demographer in the world, and he's from here, from the US, who proposed the Proximate Determinants of Fertility. And he summarizes in these papers that there are a series of different determinants of fertility that are part of our society that shape the way in which women have more or less children, or when they have children during their reproductive ages. And these overall characteristics of our society are what are called the indirect determinants of fertility. So these are socioeconomic, cultural, attitudinal, family planning, environmental variables. But these are more overall ways in which the society is organized. These indirect determinants of fertility, they influence some other characteristics of women, and these factors here are going to be the ones that directly affect the chances of women having more or less babies and when in their reproductive lives they would have children, if they have it. And these factors, which are influenced by these indirect determinants and are closer to explain fertility, are called proximate determinants of fertility. So major variables operate through proximate determinants in predicting fertility. So these major variables here, they operate through these proximate determinants to explain fertility. So this is an overall framework for predicting fertility that we have that was developed specifically by John Bongartz, and then he's going to explain exactly what are these proximate determinants of fertility. But this exercise of trying to explain what are the factors that influence fertility started even before. Davis and Blake, they kind of listed a series of intermediate variables, a group of 11 variables through which any social factor influenced the level of fertility in a specific country in a specific year. And these 11 variables that they called intermediate variables, they could be grouped in three major groups, or three phases of fertility: intercourse, conception, and gestation. And then afterwards, after Davis and Blake, they were already trying to think, okay, we have these major factors in society, and there are these intermediate variables that influence fertility. And then they came up with this list of 11 variables. And what Bongers did, he kind of tried to personalize a little more. He tried to simplify the number of variables that were actually more important. And he also kind of indicated really clear how to estimate this major, the most important proximate determinants of fertility that influence the levels of fertility of women in a specific country. So out of these 11 variables, 4 of them account for most of the differences in fertility between populations. And the importance of these 4 major variables that came out from these 11, they vary, their importance vary across time and across countries, right? Across space as well. So let's just see which ones are these variables. So these are the 11 overall variables that Davis and Blake suggested as the intermediate variables that would be closer to explain fertility, and these intermediate variables are influenced by how the society is organized about these major factors. So they have like all these 11 variables here. And as I said, the 11 variables are can be grouped in these different phases of fertility. So intercourse variables from 1 to 6, conception variables 7 to 9, and gestation variables 10 to 11. What Bongers did was like, okay, these 11 variables here, they are good to make us understand why we have the current levels and patterns of fertility in a specific country in a specific year. But these 4 variables here are the most important ones. Age of entry into sexual unions, fecundity or infecundity as affected by involuntary causes, but include breastfeeding, use or non-use of contraception, and fetal mortality from voluntary causes, or in other words, induced abortion. So these 4 variables are the main variables that John Bongers mentioned as being the ones that account for most of the difference of fertility between populations. Their importance may vary across time and space, but these are the 4 variables. So the intermediate variables proposed by Davis and Blake, the idea is that behavior and biological variables are directly influencing fertility. And other social, economic, cultural, environmental factors influence fertility through these intermediate variables. And as I said, we have the 4 groups: intercourse, conception, and gestation phases of fertility. And the variables, these 11 variables, are included within each one of these groups. So this table here, this slide here is just a summary of this table here, but it's pretty much the same idea. And what John Bongers said was like, hey, let's just try to create a system and a model in which you get the most important intermediate variables and kind of say how exactly we can estimate them and analyze their association, their influence on fertility levels. And these 4 major variables he called proximate determinants of fertility. And the idea was to use them in order to, including quantitative analysis of reproduction, like regression analysis, statistical regression analysis, in order to see how is the influence of these 4 major variables on fertility of women and how that varies through time in between countries. So he was pretty much trying to create a simple model to explain fertility. And this is one of the most useful frameworks for studying fertility, even today. So out of those 11 variables that Davis and Blake proposed, Bonger said, oh, we actually can summarize them into these 7 proximate determinants of fertility: marriage and marital disruption, contraceptive use, induced abortion, and duration of postpartum fecundability, but also waiting time to conception, risk of intrauterine mortality, and onset of permanent sterility. But he will say that these first 4 are the most important, which are the ones highlighted in that previous table. Number 1, 7, 8, and 11 are exactly these variables here: marriage, contraception, abortion, postpartum fecundability. What is the postpartum fecundability? It's the moment after birth that women are breastfeeding, and then their chances of having another baby drops a lot, exactly because they are breastfeeding their current baby, right? So the first 4: marriage, contraception, abortion, and postpartum fecundability. How exactly they influence fertility? So the proportion of women married, it's important for us to understand the limited exposure to intercourse. Younger women have usually less sexual activities. Households with both mother and father have closer surveillance. When you have mothers that are well educated, they give more awareness to their daughters of the cost of pregnancy, so that tends to limit the exposure to sexual activities. Later age at marriage also influences in a negative way the levels of fertility. Use of contraception: women who use contraception have lower chances to have children. Abortion, and involuntary infecundity, which is what I just said. Breastfeeding prolongs postpartum amenorrhea and suppresses ovulation when women are breastfeeding their baby. So these are the main proximate determinants. So he's just simplifying, getting from the 11, going to the 7, and now into the 4. So just simplifying our model, we have a series of indirect determinants of fertility, which are socioeconomic, cultural, attitudinal, family planning, environmental characteristics of our society. They influence these 7 proximate determinants of fertility: proportion married, contraception, abortion, postpartum, fecundability, time to conception, intrauterine mortality and sterility, and those influence fertility. But as Bonger said, the first 4 are the most important. And how exactly do you measure the first 4? So just to explain again, we got out from the 11 intermediate variables of fertility from Davis and Blake. Bonger said these are the most important, the 7, and among the 7, these 4 explain most of the variation in fertility. How do you suggest us estimating indicators in a specific society to measure this? And that's this next slide. He suggests estimating this marriage pattern index, the contraception index, the abortion index, and the postpartum fecundability index. So these are indices for the first 4, the most important proximate determinants. And they range all of them from 0 to 1. 0 is the greatest inhibiting effect on fertility, and 1, no inhibiting effect on fertility. So the marriage pattern index is going to be 1 when all women are married. So if all women are married, there is no inhibiting effect on the fact that they will have sexual relations with their partners. and it's going to be 0 when none are married. And this is just related to marriage. Contraception. 1, when no contraception is used, there is no inhibiting effect on fertility. And then 0, when all women are using effective contraceptives, that's the greatest inhibiting effect on fertility. Abortion index. 1, when there is no abortion, no induced abortion, no inhibiting effect on fertility, and 0, when every pregnancy is aborted. Of course, the numbers of 1 and 0 are the extremes. You don't verify 1 and 0 in any society in any year. The numbers will be between 0 and 1. What I'm just showing here is to show what are the extremes of each one of these indices that can vary from 0 to 1. In the case of postpartum fecundability index, it's going to be 1 when no women are in the period of postpartum fecundability, so there's no inhibiting effect on fertility, and 0 when all women are breastfeeding. So that's the greatest inhibiting effect on fertility. But again, what we're going to try to estimate for each one of these countries in each one of the years are these indices of marriage, contraception, abortion, and postpartum fecundability that will vary between 0 and 1. Closer to 0, more inhibiting effect. Closer to 1, no inhibiting effect on fertility. And then more recent studies, they say that we should update even the models that Bonger suggested to us in order to take into account changes that we experience in our modern societies. Instead of getting proportion of women married as the chances of women having sexual activities and getting pregnant, it's better to use sexual activity instead of marriage as an indicator of exposure to pregnancy, because now sexual activity is much more normal and accepted before marriage. We could also extend the sterility index to measure fecundity from all causes, not only to postpartum fecundability because of breastfeeding of the babies. Revision of the contraception index to consider the fact that users of sterilization could become infecund before the age of 49. A lot of women, they reach the desired number of children before the age of 49, so they pass through female sterilization, so they are pretty much out of the risk of having children. Really, really small chances of having something wrong with the operation and they getting pregnant again. So these women are out of the chance of getting pregnant. And change of the estimate of total fecundity as well, related to this, the fact of sterilization being performed with a more regular basis in our contemporary modern societies. So, the first portion of this lecture, we talk about major concepts in fertility. The second part was, how do we calculate fertility indicators? And I showed you in the Excel spreadsheet. And then now we try to explain why we have these levels of fertility in specific countries, and we pretty much use the idea of these proximate determinants of fertility, right? And then now I'm going to show you examples of trends and patterns of fertility, first in the world and then afterwards in the US. So high fertility countries are those with total fertility rates higher than 3.2 children per woman. And this is the case of mostly sub-Saharan African countries. And they have been experiencing gradual decreases in fertility rates. And we expect these decreases to keep going in these next decades. Low fertility countries are those with total fertility rates below 2 children per woman. So women on average are having less than 2 children. And I mentioned to you already, what is the replacement level of fertility? Women on average have to have 2.1 children throughout their reproductive ages, because those children, on average 2.1, you replace the mothers and the partners. Why 2.1? Remember the net reproduction rate. Some of these women will die before reaching the end of their reproductive ages. The same thing with the daughters. So 2.1, because some of these daughters will die before reaching the end of their reproductive ages. So women have to have, on average, a little more than 2, because some of the daughters will not reach 49 years of age. And also because we know the sex ratio at birth, as we saw also in this lecture, is usually above 100. So on average, we have more boys than girls being born in different countries in different years. So we have to have a little more than 2 children per woman in order for the daughters to replace the mothers. If we are talking about the net reproduction rate, it's 1 daughter per woman is that's the replacement level. When we are talking about total fertility rates, this average number for replacement level is taken as 2.1 children per woman, exactly because some of the daughters will die before age 49, and because we have more boys being born, so we need a little more children in order to have enough daughters to replace the mothers. In the countries that are below the replacement level, below 2.1 children per woman, are European, Asian, Latin American, Caribbean countries. And in these last decades, we have seen some slight increases in the countries that experience the lowest low fertility rates. And this is expected to happen in these next 2 decades as well. Some countries reached really low levels of fertility, and now they're starting to increase again. So in this case, it's not because women suddenly decided to have more children. It's just because there was a change in the age in which women decided to have children. They're investing more in education, they're investing more in getting good jobs, so they delay marriage, they delay having children, so they postpone the age in which they have children. But after they get the desired education, get a good job, and then they get married, they start to have children, and at the end of their reproductive lives, on average, they will tend to have similar number of children as their previous generation of women. So this effect that in the short term, we see a decline in fertility. That's a period effect that we see in the short term. But this effect is driven a lot by the postponement in fertility, the tempo effect, the time effect, in which women are postponing the age of having children. Then when they start to have children at older ages, the total fertility rates will increase again. And when their daughters get into those ages, they will start to have children again. And then the total fertility rates will tend to be a little more stable, right? It declines, women start to have children, but then the newer generations come back after them, reaching those ages in which they want to have children as well, older ages. And then the fertility doesn't drop as much as we saw for some of these countries. In this case, just to better explain these terms of low fertility, very low, and lowest low, Wheeler and Kohler, they classified countries based on these criteria here. 43 countries in 2013 were classified as having low fertility, fertility between 2.1 and 1.6. So fertility already below the replacement level, but down until an average of 1.6 children per woman. Very low fertility, those countries, around 27 in 2013, that had total fertility rates between 1.5 and 1.3. Lowest low fertility, the ones with the lowest ones in the world, 9 countries in 2013, with total fertility rates under 1.3 children per woman. That's the case of South Korea, Taiwan, Poland, Portugal, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Macau, right? So this is Interesting, but like I just mentioned, some of these countries have this postponement in fertility and they are coming back. But a lot of these countries are actually just staying in really low levels. And that's the case, for example, of South Korea, that have really low levels of fertility because it's really expensive to having children going to college and having to pay private tutors and so on. And so couples, they invest on one child only to have good education. And that's because how the society is organized, right? So some societies might bounce back because of this postponed fertility, but some societies might stay with really low levels of fertility. And in some countries, they will experience depopulation. So pretty much decline in population size. And this depopulation, the decline in overall population size is projected to happen in most countries in the next 50 to 100 years. And this rate of depopulation is based on the rate of natural increase, the RNI. The rate of natural increase, how do you calculate it? It's kind of simple with the crude birth rate. How do you calculate the crude birth rate? The number of births in a specific country in a specific year divided by the population in that country in that year. Crude death rate, the number of deaths in a specific country in a specific year divided by the population. One minus the other divided by 10. Since the crude birth rate and the crude death rate are per 1,000, if you divide by 10, the rate of natural increase gives the information percentage form. Yeah, so the crude birth rate and the crude death rate are usually per 1,000. Divided by 10, you have the percentage information for the rate of natural increase. There was already no population growth in Europe in 2014, so the rate of natural increase equals to 0%. And some countries already have zero or negative rates of natural increase, such as Bulgaria and Serbia, minus 0.5%. Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Ukraine, minus 0.4%, Germany, Italy, and Russia right now is still not negative, but projections of the Russian population, exactly because fertility has been declining, the Russian population is expected to decrease from 143 million. Sorry, 143 million in 2014 to 134 million in 2050. Sorry about that. This is something that I mentioned to you before. Total fertility rate at or near replacement of 2.1 are needed for a population to remain stable, because then you would have enough children to replace the couples, or more specific, enough daughters to replace the population of mothers. In 2013, 79 countries with had total fertility rates at or lower than the replacement level. And some countries with low total fertility rates do not experience depopulation, because still we have large numbers of women in childbearing years between 15 and 49 years of age because of past high fertility. So a lot of these countries, although they have low levels of fertility rates, they are not experiencing depopulation because the overall number of women in reproductive age is still high. African countries, we see lower rates of fertility in African countries in recent decades compared to previous years, lower rates of mortality and immigration as well. So they also have improvements in health, which declines mortality. And this trend will be responsible for depopulation even in some African countries in the next 50 years or so. But as we saw in some in previous lectures, the population in Africa is expected to still increase as a whole, as a continent, up to 2050 and 2100. And then we tend to stabilize a little bit. But in some specific African countries that are experiencing declines in fertility, we also see depopulation in those countries as well. Why is it important to understand low fertility levels for all these different countries? With fertility decline, the birth cohorts, they become smaller. So the number of children in that population becomes smaller. And this pattern, and then increases in life expectancy, lead to an aging population. So you have less children being born, and then people living longer. So you have higher life expectancy, and that will cause the population to get older. So you have larger proportion of the population that is older than 65 years of age, and a smaller proportion of people in working ages. And that's related to the demographic dividend, right? You have a decline in fertility, and then you reach a specific time, a specific window of opportunity in your country that the number of children and older people is at the lowest level comparing to the working age population. But as population starts to get older, then the total dependency ratio starts to increase again, because now you have more older people proportionally. So between 2005 and 2050, the old age dependency ratio will double in developed countries. So the total dependency ratio, we get the number of children, the number of older people, divided by the number of people in working age. 4.4% the old age dependency ratio between 2005 and 2050. Healthcare and patient programs not well equipped in some of these countries will have to deal with the pressure and the needs of this elderly population. So if the countries don't get ready now, they will suffer the pressure of elderly population needing healthcare and patient programs later in their lives. Wow, my voice is starting to disappear. I'm sorry about that. And then here, we start with fertility changes in the US. The US also had a rapid decrease in total fertility rates from 7 to under 4 children per woman between 1800 and 1900. In the early 20th century, we have a sustained fertility decline related to economic transition, economic development, industrialization, and urbanization. People move to urban areas. It's more expensive to have children, and because then you have to invest in their education, and you start to have less children related to this urbanization process and industrialization process. And also because, as we talked before about the demographic transition model, mortality rates declined, so people realize that they don't have to have as many children for them to survive at old age, so the fertility declines even in previous decades as well. The US decline in total fertility is just below 2, as we saw in the Population Reference Bureau and some days ago. The total fertility rate in the US in 2018 was estimating 1.78 children per woman. And this is really low level since the peak of 3.7 TFR in the late 1950s. After World War II, we had an increase in fertility rates in the US, and then after that, it started to decline again. The rate of natural increase in the US is still positive. It's the highest rate of natural increase of any of the developed countries, and this is usually driven by higher fertility rates among Hispanic population and from immigrant groups. And the overall population is getting older in proportion proportion, you have higher proportion of people with at least 65 years of age, because you have improvements in health and so on, people having fewer children and living longer. You have this aging population process going on in the country. It's exactly 4:30 now, so I will continue on this topic in the next class. We still have, let me just show you here the part about the US. I focus on adolescent fertility, non-marital fertility, childlessness, and then male fertility. And then after that, we will enter mortality. So the quiz 10 is available now on the website. I saw that some of you wrote messages to me on Canvas. If you want to communicate with me, please write by email, because I don't check those messages on Canvas as much. So if you want to talk to me, email me, I will answer more rapidly. We will have our class, next class on Thursday. We probably start mortality there. And until the point that we reach, on Tuesday next week, we will have our exam 2. And as I mentioned, I will give extra points, and it's written here in the syllabus, that will add up to 4 extra points that you can have throughout the semester. And there will be pretty much extra questions in the next exams and quizzes. And those quizzes and exams that have extra questions, I will give extra time proportionally to answer those questions. Cool. So thank you very much, and I see you guys on Thursday, and I hope that by Thursday you'll be able to go to the classroom, but I will keep you updated. Thank you very much.